The info war rages on as to whether UFO sightings are a matter of extraterrestrial or military presence. David Hatcher Childress has jumped into the conversation with his new book, The Anti-Gravity Files, which details intriguing information about many of the exotic technology patents that have been filed over the past 60 years and the implications of them being granted. Has the military-industrial complex mastered anti-gravity propulsion, normally credited to ET craft, or are both true? David, welcome to the show. I think many people here are familiar with your face from Ancient Aliens and a passion for this particular topic. So it's good that you're here. The book is a real, I found it very interesting because you're kind of looking at the chronology of what all these different brilliant minds on the planet, terrestrial minds, have come up with. And some of it is, you know, it's almost massively overwhelming in its technicality in terms of what they applied for. I don't even understand half the physics of it. And some of it's just really fun when you're looking at the ideas people had about these little private craft kind of propelling us through space as individuals, you know, a little cart almost in space. I mean, so tell us what propelled you down this path of, you know, exploring propulsion.
Yeah, I've always been interested in the unexplained and UFOs. As a kid, I read in the late 60s and early 70s lots of UFO books and paranormal things and ESP and reincarnation, everything from Atlantis to Bigfoot. I was always very much interested in those things. And world travel, I've always loved history too. So Tesla and Einstein and ancient technology too, going to the Great Pyramid and obelisks. I'm the author of over 20 books, and some of my books are about ancient Hindu aircraft, Vimanas.
Right. I remember that, yeah.
And so I'm a believer in ancient technology, in advanced ancient civilizations. I believe there are structures on the moon. I do believe that there's extraterrestrial life out there as well. I'm not so sure that all of the UFOs that we're seeing are extraterrestrials. In fact, I think many of them are terrestrial craft.
And that's the conversation we're going to be getting into and detailing, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, even some terrestrial craft I think are ancient craft. And I believe that there have been societies on planet Earth who built the Great Pyramid and all these megaliths, lifting 1,000-pound blocks of stone, and that they had to have also some kind of anti-gravity or levitation to do that. And the whole subject has fascinated me for a long time. It wasn't until really the mid-'80s when I returned from traveling all over the world and living in India and Africa and the Far East that I went to the Midwest and to a sort of a New Age community there, and that's where I really found out a lot of stuff about Tesla. And though I was a good student and somebody who was interested in science and whatnot, I knew very little about Tesla. And what I realized later as I began to study him and anti-gravity and a lot of this kind of super science was that Tesla was not only the most incredible genius who electrified the world today with his AC inventions, but that he also invented anti-gravity type devices, although he never gave us any patents for it, and that he ultimately became a suppressed person. And to the point where people are going to go to high school and college and they're going to learn that Otis invented the elevator and Edison invented the photograph, but you're not going to learn much about Tesla. It's because they don't want you to know much about him. That's what I believe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he was a dangerous mind in a time when it wasn't desirable. And, you know, to this day, I think it's interesting that he has been vindicated mostly through the work of everybody else that points to him and say, well, if he hadn't done it, we wouldn't be able to do it. So kind of in a backward sense, he has finally earned the place that he deserved in history. So I understand. So going through all of this, and then again, your participation on the very wildly popular show, Ancient Aliens. I think that's one of the network's most popular shows, if not the most, right?
For History Channel?
Yeah.
It's not their most popular in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, actually, the Pawn Stars show about the pawn shop in Las Vegas.
Well, of course, it's America.
Yeah, it was more, and also the Oak Island show actually outrates the
Okay.
Ancient Aliens. But I think as an international show, Ancient Aliens is perhaps their most popular. It's widely popular in Latin America and in Asia and in Europe.
Yeah, I believe that. It's very well produced, too.
I'm a big fan, actually, of the old serials of the 1930s. And that's really where, say, Indiana Jones and the Star Wars movies really come from the old serials of the 30s. Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, The Lost City. And when you watch those old serials, they are full of Tesla technology. They're battling with ray guns, they're zapping each other, everything's electric. Their spaceships are not rockets, they're electric craft, zapping and crackling with electricity as they zoom off to the moon. And you know, one of the popular it was the 40 serial, was Radar Men from the Moon. And they were going to the moon, they're flying around in these rocket ships, they have their death rays. This was the 1930s. Towers, Tesla towers. When you read magazines like Electrical Experimenter in the 1930s, there would be articles about Tesla and his towers and anti-gravity airships and death rays and these powerful searchlight beams and tractor beams. All the things that we got again in the 60s in Star Trek and things.
So you believe the producers of those very early shows were actually familiar with Tesla's
Oh, yes, and almost everyone was, and Tesla was very famous then.
Yeah.
Tesla was still
a known entity.
Known person, and particularly in New York, on his birthday, he was known as an eccentric, of course, and this is one of the things about Tesla. He was something of a misfit. He was a terrible businessman.
He was antisocial, more or less.
Yeah, he was antisocial. He never got married or really dated. He had a number of phobias. He couldn't have a peach on his table. He would go through napkins and silverware.
Sounds like Howard Hughes. But then he comes into the story later. So
okay, right. So with Tesla, on his birthday, reporters would come to him and he would proclaim all kinds of fantastic things, talk about death rays. And in 1940, they started creating these Max Fleischer cartoons for the movie theaters with Superman. And those cartoons are public domain today. And the very first one of those cartoons is Superman battling this mad scientist. And he's clearly Tesla. He's got this Magneto death ray. He looks like Tesla. They don't call him Tesla in the cartoon, but they've turned him into evil nemesis, and Superman has to stop him. And so they really created the mad scientist at this time, and other movies.
I mean, you have to give him credit. It's very clever. The mass manipulation of consciousness is not that hard to do if it starts with something as simple as that, something as childlike and seemingly innocent as a comic book or a movie.
Yes, right. And Tesla appeared in other of these Superman cartoons, also as the mad scientist, Superman sort of battled him over and over again. Tesla died during World War II. He died in 1943.
Whatever Tesla was trying to do 100 years ago took us time. We're slow learners, but it is coming to the forefront now. As far as electricity goes, I remember asking, because no one really understands electricity, I remember asking Patrick Flanagan one day, I said, Patrick, what's electricity anyway? He said, oh, well, that's when energy flows from a higher potential into a lower potential to be utilized. And I thought, okay, thank you. I want to see what that looks like, you know?
Well, and in the same way, we don't really understand what gravity is either.
And that's where we're going to go now in the conversation. Gravity. These are anti-gravity craft, yet science itself is not at all in consensus on what gravity is. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how mathematics and gravity seem, the current understanding of gravity, which is incomplete, but still the current understanding in humanity, how those two fields have had to parallel each other and why.
Well, right, and I'm not a physicist or an electrical engineer. I'm a total lay person who just is interested in these things.
Right.
Einstein said in the 1920s, he talked about what was called the unified field. And according to Einstein, the unified field was a combination of electricity and magnetism
Yep.
and gravity, those three forces. And then there's also what they call the weak force, or the nuclear force would be a fourth force. But so with the unified field, then with Einstein was saying that, yeah, once you understand the unified field, you can then come up with, say, an electromagnetism equation. And we have that. There's an equation for electromagnetism. But with what Einstein was also saying was that with the unified field, you're going to also have an equation for electrogravity, and also, because magnetism is part of this too, you would have an equation for magnetogravity as well. Now, these equations are not published. This is where the researchers are looking into these things. And what is, the term anti-gravity is, it's kind of a buzzword. A lot of physicists don't like it. It's one of those knee-jerk words. When I first published my first book on the subject, called the Anti-Gravity Handbook, in 1985, my goal was, at that point, was to make the term anti-gravity a popular term. I wanted it to be a household name, anti-gravity. Later, we published books by Maury B. King on tapping the zero-point energy. So we wanted also to bring that term, zero-point energy.
Then came over unity and all these terms floated on the heels
over
of
unity
it.
generators and things like that. So with gravity control or anti-gravity, what it really means is, artificial gravity, gravity control,
Working against gravity.
Anti-gravity. A gyro
Right.
is anti-gravity. And in fact, back in the 80s, there was a free energy researcher named Joseph Newman. And he was fortunate to get on the Johnny Carson show in the late 1970s. And Johnny Carson had him on just for 15 minutes or something. And Johnny Carson wanted him to explain his free energy motor. And Joseph Newman was popular for a little while, but he had a hard time explaining exactly how I was saying.
Minutes.
But he brought a gyro.
Yeah.
And he tried to explain his invention in terms of a simple gyro. Gyros are anti-gravity. And they're used. You can buy them at a toy store. But gyros are also used in Coast Guard cutters. They're used in special ships. They're used for balancing. And there's special things about gyros. The more you know about gyros and certain types of gyros, you get into classified military material.
So extend that into UFOs.
Yes, right. So now let's in some ways, some UFOs, it appears, and I talk about this in the book, are flying gyros. There's something else, too, that goes back to the ancient Indian texts on Vimanas and things. And some of these are pretty technical, although it's difficult to really sort out, exactly what technology they're talking about.
How did the Veda texts relay them?
Okay, they would talk about crystals and certain poles, like towers, like the Tesla towers or a Tesla coil. But part of the workings, at least of some of the Vimanas, according to the ancient texts, Mercury was part of it. And that is very curious. Interesting. So Mercury, as I started researching all this, particularly the early books into anti-gravity, and it's in my current book, The Anti-Gravity Files. Right. Mercury is an unusual and unique element. It's also a metal, and it's a liquid, and it's a conductor.
And it always shows up in alchemical texts, no matter what the tradition.
Mercury is very special. And there's things you can do with Mercury that you cannot do with anything else. And the Vimana texts would talk about Mercury. Now, let's go back to World War II. Towards the end of World War II, as the Allies were bombing Germany, and Germany was losing the war, and we were basically on our way to Berlin with all the armies. At that point, Foo Fighters began showing up in the skies over Germany. The Foo Fighters apparently were kind of a basketball or larger sized glass ball of some sort. It was filled with mercury. That mercury was put in a gyroscopic swirling manner and then electrified. So you have essentially what what we call, and we talk about in the book, as a mercury vortex generator. So you now have a gyro that's electric, has a swirling plasma of mercury that's electrified. When you electrify mercury like that, it becomes an electrified gas, which is known as a plasma. It's bright. It's like a bright light. It's swirling and spinning. It's a vortex, and apparently it has anti-gravity effects. What the Foo Fighters were doing, apparently, during World War II, now you have certain people on the UFO side who believe that Foo Fighters were extraterrestrials coming to Earth and watching the final battles of World War II, in a sense, over Germany. From a Tesla standpoint, yeah, these are mercury gyros that fly. They pulse power, and they emit a pulsing electromagnetic pulse.
So what was their purpose?
The purpose was to stall the engines of the bombers.
To mess with their electrical
the electrical system of the bombers, yeah, and make the engines cut out, and the electrical system of the bomber would fail. It would be like the very common stories of flying saucer hovering over your car or something at night, and your car not working.
Right.
All right, and until that craft has left and the strong electromagnetic field that's emanating from it is gone, then your car will start again.
Right back,
okay,
yeah.
And that's what was going on with the Foo Fighters over Germany. So what was going on then was, as the American bombers coming from bases in Britain are flying over Germany, they're suddenly seeing these swarms of glowing balls of light spinning, and there would be swarms of them around and at the height of the bombers. And they would and the bombers even would somehow attract the Foo Fighters. And then, as the swarm of Foo Fighters were around, the electrical system of the bomber would start to fail, and the engines go out. And then this is what the Germans wanted, was that the bombers would then drop their bombs on a farmer's field in Western Germany and turn back to Britain and not make it to Dresden or Berlin for the saturation bombing. In the end, there's the overwhelming number of bombers that the Americans and British were able to come up with. I mean, we overwhelmed the Germans, and it failed.
It's a very interesting theory on what those are, though.
Well, and here's the thing. Is
the Foo Fighters.
Exactly. And I have a whole chapter in the new book about Foo Fighters because I think they're very important.
Right, I saw it, yeah.
And this is part of the thing, too, when you come out of World War II, there are things in World War II that are still classified and secret. The British, particularly, have all kinds of secrets during World War II that they have never declassified, and it's well known in Britain. The U.S., too. We supposedly have, largely declassified most of the things from World War II. Americans like to think that, but I think that's not the truth.
No, I don't.
But Foo Fighters are part of this, and it's something that's never really addressed. And at this point, the U.S. military has never, ever told us what Foo Fighters were, told us that they even existed, filled us in on the technology behind Foo Fighters. We just don't know. I mean, they ignore it. But it apparently was something that generally happened during World War II. And it was something the Germans were making. Later, the Germans allegedly created these Virile craft and Honeyboo craft.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's the same technology. And in fact, if one possible diagram of one of these craft, and when you see the Honeyboo or the Virile craft, they look like this. They have little domes beneath them, which would be these,
like the little Foo Fighter
thing, cells there.
Right.
And you would have like 3 of them, and these things are directional. The whole thing is, lifting up, but by tilting and doing that, you're taking off this way, that way, how to control these things.
So where do you think that technology may have originally come from?
Well, I ultimately believe it came from Tesla, but the Germans were doing all kinds of experiments, and we were talking about this earlier too, with that are not having oil things. So they were looking at alternative things, and they were looking at ancient texts. And the Germans were very interested in the Aryan texts, these Sanskrit texts, Vimanas. They were going to Tibet. They believed in Atlantis, the Tool Society. They were sending submarines to Antarctica at that time. What went on towards the end of World War II is really something else. And we still don't know exactly what happened.
Antarctica was...
They went to Antarctica, they went to South America.
Technologically involved in all this.
I think so, that's right, yeah. And they had bases, secret bases in Greenland too, and in the Canary Islands.
Just kind of hid everything under the ice.
Well, and underground. These underground sub-pens and things like that.
Right.
The Germans used submarines very, very extensively. And there was also what they called the Black Uboats. It's believed that a number of U-boats after World War II were still operational.
Right.
2 surrendered in Argentina about a year at the end of the war, and those 2 U-boats had apparently been in Antarctica.
Yes, I've done a couple of shows on that.
Right,
yes.
But other U-boats were also kept going. A U-boat was found that was sunk off of Indonesia. It had a cargo of mercury. Then, just about 10 years ago, there was an interesting story that was out of Norway, and I pay attention to any news article that has to do with German U-boats and also has to do with mercury. And there was a U-boat that was found sunken in a fjord in Norway and had been there since World War II. And they were worried about it because it had a cargo of mercury. So why are these U-boats carrying these huge cargoes of mercury? They were apparently shipping mercury to Japan. Later, Foo Fighters were seen around the Korean War in Japan, flying saucers seen there. It seems so fantastic to people. And even today, 50, 60, 70 years after World War II, people cannot wrap their heads around Foo Fighters, around early flying saucer sightings. Around Los Angeles in the early 50s, fleets of flying saucers were seen flying over. It was almost a daily thing. Columnists would write about it. There's the famous Lubbock Lights, which were also photographed in the 1950s. And they were flying saucers flying in V formation. Along those lines, it's been said by other people that the technology that we get as the public is something that the military has already had for 50 years.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, whatever we have, whether it's computers and Wi-Fi and all kinds of things, the military's had it,
since World War II.
Since, for 50 years. And there's a point where it gets declassified or just slips out into the mainstream. And I believe, honestly, that the military, over time, does want these technologies to come out.
But they're answering to someone else, always, right?
Well, and there's the command control, structure. One thing that I hear a lot of from people who are skeptic of this is that, I was in the military or I worked for NASA, and they're not smart enough to keep those secrets. I mean, I was in the Army. I would know all these things, and and that's the thing. You're like, oh no, you wouldn't. That's right. I mean, not even elected officials are allowed this kind of stuff. It is super secret.
Right, until the stocks of all those companies have tanked and they have to revision themselves into healthy technologies.
And shows like yours that are, I think, steadily educating people and giving them a new idea of perhaps how to think about all this.
Yeah, I think so, and work like yours as well. And I thank you for joining us here today. I appreciate it, David. You've been a long time and you've published a lot of works and given people a lot to chew on.
Thank you.
The name of the book, again, is The Anti-Gravity Files, for anyone who's interested in the scientific trail behind all of this phenomena. Until next time, thank you for joining us here on Open Minds.
Common people around the world are doing the uncommon.
I mean, it is literally the Netflix of spirituality.